Bernard Tobin here at the World Dairy Expo. Catching up now with Mark Stephenson. He's a dairy policy analyst for the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Mark, how's it going?
It's going well, thanks. And welcome, by the way, to World Dairy Expo. A lot of people here, as always.
Appreciate it, Mark. You and I talk pretty much every year when I come down here. We always talk trade, talk supply management, what's happening north and south of the border. I want to start this conversation with Agricultural Secretary Sonny Perdue. He had an open house here, town hall yesterday, and one producer stood up and asked him, Mr. Perdue, would you consider a supply management system for U.S. farmers? And I think the answer was a polite no. But, is that a type of conversation or question that you hear more of here in Wisconsin, in the U.S. today?
It certainly is. I mean, we looked at a number of systems for some kind of supply management back in 2012. At the time, we were headed into our previous farm bill, not the one we're currently in. And there was some interest at that point in time, but that waned pretty quickly. But this year, we've had a lot more interest because we're going into our fifth year of relatively low milk prices. Farms have been exiting the business at a very high rate, and a lot of people are saying, could we have had a different outcome? Is there something that we could have done that might have, slowed this rate of exit, given us more controlled growth, better profitability on farms?
Now, you've actually just, I think, completed recently some more analysis on supply management options. You looked at three particular models in the U.S., focusing, I think, on 2014 to 2020 profitability. Talk about the models and what they would do to manage supply.
I'd be happy to do that. And I will say we love our Canadian friends to the north, but there's been no discussion seriously in moving forward at looking at anything that would be quite as rigid and hard, I guess, as that kind of supply management. What the ones that we're looking at was a group of three opportunities that would say, under different kinds of conditions, we want you to think about growing. I mean, a profitable year, a high milk price or something like that is really a signal from a marketplace telling folks we want more milk. But when 37,000 producers all make that decision at the same point in time, we can overshoot the market needs, and that's what's happened. So this is really more about more thoughtful growth, and they would do that by having allowable amount of growth that could happen on a dairy farm without any monetary penalty. And if you exceeded that growth level, then you would incur a penalty for a period of 1 year.
Right, so basically trying to control supply by not overproducing.
That's correct. As I said, it's not a restriction against how much milk you can produce or market, but it is a restriction in terms of just what it might cost you to do that. I mean, just as an example, two of the programs had what we call market access fees. So those would be fees that would be assessed for every 100 pounds of milk that a producer sells to the marketplace. And if after that year's period of time they didn't exceed the allowable growth that the farm had, then they could apply for and receive not only those fees back, but a pooled value of the fees that were collected from producers that did go above that growth. So it's an enhancement to their milk price. One, by raising the market price of milk for everybody, but two, by bringing back some additional funds, from producers that did choose to grow. So I think that what that does is that it makes producers thoughtful about when do I want to grow and by how much. So I think that what we see from this modeling effort that was done was that the growth would be more likely to happen in spurts. So you just recognize up front that if I'm going to grow, then I'm going to have a year that I have to pay that penalty, and you build that into your costs of expansion. I mean, currently in the U.S., it's maybe $7,000, $8,000, up to $10,000 for building and facilities and animals to put a cow into a system. So under this, you'd have to throw another $1,200, $1,500 into that planning process for year one anyway.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about, I guess, overall an assessment from positives and negatives. You talked about some of the positives, and I think, reducing price variations, enhanced prices. You even had some increased net income. Was it a sense that there could be some positives there?
Oh, we definitely see some positives. I mean, I think the negatives are that you can't always expand production at the kind of rate that you might want to, or you do at least with a penalty. That's clearly the downside. But as you mentioned, the upside is that we do have a higher market price. In most scenarios, it's less volatile. If we look at even government costs for programs like our dairy margin coverage program, if you're not putting milk prices into that lower level, then it doesn't trigger that program very often, and so you reduce taxpayer expenditures to support programs like that.
Now, I thought there was some negatives mentioned, obviously, as well. You saw a decrease in consumption.
Sure, and I know that I've read a number of reports from Canada where you're in denial that consumers actually care at all about prices for milk and dairy products, but at least here in the U.S. and indeed most countries, they do. Now, it may not mean that they run away from milk and say, oh, I'm not having that anymore, but you think a little bit more about just how much I'm going to buy, and it may not be the individual consumer going to the grocery store as much as it is the restaurants or the other industries that buy large quantities of cheese or dairy ingredients and use them. They may change recipes a little bit, and thus the volume.
Final question, Mark, and that is, we've talked about the Canadian version of supply management, what you're doing here. Are there some principles here, and we wouldn't call it supply management, but there's obviously some policies, some approaches here that may benefit, producers in the U.S. Do you think there might be something here that the industry, the country could grab onto?
I think there is, but this always comes down to what's the will, the political will, if you will. Dairy programs tend to confuse people outside the dairy industry. Our milk pricing systems and a variety of other things just seem complicated to people, and that includes Washington. And Washington has told us for years, this stuff makes my head hurt. If you could tell me what you want and come with one voice and speak to us, you'd probably get it. And so if the dairy industry essentially came to Washington and said, we really want some kind of better coordination on our milk supply, and this is a program that we think would do it, I think we'd get it in a heartbeat. The real question is whether we could speak with one voice. My guess is we can't, and so my guess is that it makes it more difficult to get something like this passed.
Yeah, so we heard a few people in that audience that Mr. Perdue had asking this question, but just not enough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it is just that matter of is there truly momentum for this? Does it represent enough people? And I think that we also got some comments at that meeting from our Secretary Perdue about, I like small farms, but they may not survive.
Yeah. Mark, always great to talk with you down here at World Dairy. Thank you so much for stopping by.
You're welcome, Bernard. Nice to see you again.